So, Jason, you want to start?
Okay, so the title is Change, question mark, social change, question mark, system change, question mark. And I think today my centerpiece is this new term I call actons. So in search of right actons. First, my position was stated in the very beginning of the first conference. We should not reinvent the wheel, but look at what other people are already doing. And in terms of this book, representing what I said, the Change Handbook, organized by this group of people from Organizational Development Network. I followed them up from the very early first version in which they had 18 different tools or procedures of doing the organizational change. Something similar like if you need to do a surgery, you have to, the surgeon will provide you a process, they say, a procedure. So from 18, and the new version of this book, the 18 grows into 61. And what I was trying to promote is our Winthrop Roundtable Leadership Program might be the 62nd on that list. So I should emphasize that we need to pay attention to people in the practice world instead of just abstract academics. Change to a different order or to chaos is or no order, and immediately bring the question of whose order, defined by whom. So for my thinking, change equals shifting of the current status quo to a different stabilizing mechanism, or what they call new order, emerges to replace the previous stabilizing mechanism. So it's one stabilizing mechanism replacing another out of date stabilizing mechanism. New order replacing old order is my definition of a change. So old saying says change is inevitable, but some people want this process to be abrupt. They want a revolution, like what we see out from outside our window. There are people trying to be revolutionary. And some people want this process to be smooth in terms of evolution. So my root fact is that 94 million plus people were murdered by communist revolution. Hundreds of millions were victimized, that including my family members. So my position is very clear. I'm for evolution, but I'm against revolution. Therefore, So I only agree evolution at this point. Now, talking about the social changes, social collective perception involves collective perception, collective cognition, and the consensus, and the coordination, and the cooperation. Now, in order to perceive change clearly, you need to see that some old order ceases to be effective, and some kind of abnormality emerges, and the abnormality becomes new normal, and the new order takes over, and this loop back to one, so you have a circle here going on. Now, excuse me, in every round, there are one individual creativity emergence. They have talks, papers, books, videos, ideas being generated at the individual level. And the next step is this idea needs to be amplified into a group, into a crowd, a so-called school of thought, which can maybe becoming dominating. And then it can spread widely, like represented by those bestseller books. And based on that, note, my perception is level by level, one build after another. So in Steve's term, improvisation, but new stuff based on older existing stuff. So and then you have new consensus emerges from this widely accepted opinion and so-called dominating public opinions. And then eventually such new order got institutionalized, and it causes decisions in action, lawmaking, etc. So in perceptions, what kind of a society I currently have and I want in the future equals my worldview about word one, word two, and word three. That is driven by three elements at least. One is my current cognition, my awareness of the current world, and driven by my past memory, because that provides a framework for me. And without that, I cannot make sense of what I see today. And of course, there is a designed future direction of anticipations. So that's why I had a dream, and blah, blah, blah. And we all want to avoid nightmare. So I put up this little equation that the current society status is equal to the integral of the summary of all the actions of action agents. So you can choose to become an action agent, and you do something, like we're doing a club of Remy right now. Here is an action. And a lot of participants' actions added together, some of them are canceling with each other. But in general, it created an impact. And that impact gets accumulated over time and lead to our current social status. And this dynamics keeps going on. So here I want to delineate first action agents, effective and efficient international organizations, governments, lawmakers, judges, opinion leaders, technology leaders, and participants, activists, initializers, facilitators, including rioters, those people looting the stores. And so all of this action actually come to here. And action agents are driven by their ideas. So next layer, we have idea feeds. Those policy reports, decision analysis, strategic suggestions, think tank white papers, action causing public opinions, and the votes and the results of voting, etc. Prioritize value principles, cultural gene codes. And here I put the word actons. Right? So I define acton similar. I'm following that tradition. Somebody defined perception, right? So the perception is more like how do you form your concept within the brain. And the acton is a type of ideas that directly lead to one's action. Similar to a sperm meets an egg and leading to new life. An acton is the idea formed by merging non-actonic ideas that triggers an action, not just a decision. It must be action-oriented. with a time subscription or deadline attached. In other words, if you want to identify an acton, it always comes with a deadline. Now or today or this week or this month or even this year, we need to do something. And that qualifies what I call acton. Now, my critique to many academics is because their talks, papers, journals, books are lack of actons. And people got amazed and soaked in those abstract ideas, but still coming out at the end of the day, they do not know what to do. So therefore, they are nearly infertile and to be buried in conference proceedings in storage, waiting to be recycled and certainly forgotten. So to emphasize, my perception is this current society status can simplify by this formula. And this here we use A to representing what I call actons, actors who do something. So that is the major idea and example. This guy, well, I think he got a big fever, fever. Yeah? He got a very hot-headed, and he was sick to create that terrible theory that generated disasters for civilization. But yesterday in the email, I told Jamie that I do give him one credit, which is this word carved on his tomb. He said, the philosophers have only interpreted the word in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So this brings back him into our theme of change. So the conclusion is, now we have to touch system change. What does that mean? Systemic or systematic change? So first, I think we need to recognize this equation focused on the resources generated, obtained and used by these actons. And for this A part, what we need to do is the awakening of all stakeholders to participate. The simplest way would be the vote, but there are many other ways to participate into the change. And for the sigma part is we need to increasing coordination and reducing conflicts, because when you put a sigma together, a lot of actions cancel each other. So it's a waste of human energy. So we need to make optimizing there. And for the integral part, we need to focus on preventing unintended consequences. This sounds familiar, right? Last year, we were working on that, trying to build an institute about unintended consequences. A few examples would be, in the traditional mainstream, people do project management, quality management, and there's kind of something overlap with the efforts here. And then we pay attention to the participation technology, that is a facilitation. So we pick up a technology of participation, and we form the WinTop toolbox. And also, we need to focus on building 5 C's, the capacity, communication, consensus, coordination, construction, eventually. System thinking on 6 directions with a rich toolbox that we covered somewhere else. So that's my 7 slides to finish.
So comments.
Well, the first thing that occurred to me early on in Jason said was about change. Changing. That a different that a different stabilizing mechanism emerges to replace the previous stabilizing mechanism. So, of course, a stabilizing mechanism is rich in negative feedback. So many of the social changes that have taken place um, have replaced a stabilizing mechanism with a destabilizing mechanism, and the whole thing flies out of control, as in the history of many revolutions. I mean, if you look at the French Revolution, um, the immediate consequences of the French Revolution were quite hideous in many ways. They were replacing a hideous system with another hideous system. And over the next couple of centuries, it stabilized, and the French democracy is actually in pretty good shape now compared to many of the world's countries. But the French democracy came about through many alterations of, first there was the monarchy, and then everybody's head was cut off, and then you had the Emperor Napoleon restoring a kind of monarchy, and then you had the Revolution of 1848, and then you had another restoration. And so through the whole 19th century, France kind of wobbled back and forth between various forms of monarchy and democracy. And it wasn't really until after World War II that it stabilized. And what we hope for now is, I mean, that's pretty tough. And that's one of the more encouraging, systems, system changes that have taken place. I mean, you brought up the example of Karl Marx, and I would say I would not blame Marx for the grotesque developments of Stalinism and Maoism, because under the Soviet Union and under the Chinese Communist Party, you could argue that they were completely hypocritical in saying that they were Marxist. They had about as much to do with Marx as Jerry Falwell has to do with Jesus. To find stabilizing mechanisms, to find negative feedback, that keeps life going, it's pretty difficult. I mean, Lowell likes to bring up, by the way, I'm seeing a lot of slowdown in everybody's movements. Are my words getting through?
Yes,
Yes.
but I have a question for
Yes.
you. Uh, Immediately this coming election day of November 3rd, there are many people predict that there's going to be another civil war after that.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
What do
That
I?
makes me nervous. Because
Oh,
I do see the trend going on there, that the deep split of this country into two different set of words, and each one is not willing to compromise with the other.
yeah.
And Marxism value is getting into our K-12 schools, sometimes secretly.
Whose value?
The Marxism ideology, their
Mm,
value system, their
mm,
concepts of seeing the difference between rich and poor, etc. I noticed some K-12 school report that they are squeezing those things into our schools.
mm,
So our youngsters are becoming more and more left-oriented, including some kids of my friends. I don't have kids, so
mm.
but some of my friends are really worried about that. That's what's going on right now.
Mm. Well, there's a lot going on right now. When we started, when I spoke at the beginning about the relief that Morton Feldman provided me this morning after reading the news that I read that was, Lowell likes to talk about the practices that were put into place by the founding fathers. I mean, once again, the word fathers is problematical, but of the United States. And the idea, the things built into the Constitution, the processes of checks and balances, are basically processes of negative feedback or stabilizing feedback. So the story that I heard this morning was, as you know, of the many sexual assault lawsuits against Donald Trump. There's this woman, Ms. Carroll, who's suing Trump at the moment in the New York State courts. And the Attorney General Barr is trying to insert himself as Trump's personal lawyer to basically place the United States government as her opponent in the lawsuit. And things like that, things like, basically, what we've seen over the past 3.5 years is the removal of the checks and balances one by one, bit by bit. And as the checks and balances disappear, the negative feedback disappears. And what we see is increasing schismogenesis, increasing positive feedback that sets the country off more and more in the direction of a monarchy, which the original documents of the country were put in place to prevent. So the stabilizing mechanisms are disappearing. And the destabilizing mechanisms, positive feedback not only leads to explosion, but it leads to schismogenesis. It leads to systems flying apart so that you have opposite extremes fighting against each other. And, I share your fear of a civil war, regardless of how the election turns out. And the previous civil war was largely regional. The current civil war, it's over many of the same issues as the last civil war, but it's no longer really regional. It's really nationwide. What I'm afraid of is that we'll become more like the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda.
If I could just comment on your approach, Jason, when you talk about the current world, the past memory, and my future. And I think that's really important to say, how do we counter what Stephen has just outlined in terms of stabilizing, destabilizing mechanisms, and we're amidst destabilizing things. In the founding of this country, they were trying to build a nation, and it was built upon Edmund Burke's notion that you build a nation through a conversation between the living, the dead, and the unborn. And that correlates exactly to your current world, past memory, and my future. So the question really is, if you're looking at systems change, how do you get that conversation embodied to bridge between what Stephen talked about, a term from Bateson, which is schismogenesis, how the system falls apart. And what's fascinating is when I was working on terrorism, is modeling the schismogenic process of terrorists within its own society. So you get a society that links, and your point about stability, but what a terrorist system does is goes outside that system but feeds back into that system and derives this energy again from its system of new recruits, etc. So it's like a strange attractor that attracts things into a system and orbits, and then has an alternative world that's parasitic upon it. And so there's various forms of stability. Terrorism is a form of stability within a culture that destabilizes the host culture. It's like a virus. So thank you for the three components, because I think that's very important to understand this concept you're trying to get across, which is an action, which is an embodiment of a sustainability feedback, negative, positive feedback loops. I think that's really very good.
Could I say something? Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. I assumed that I was muted all this time.
Oh, no.
No. Sorry. Well, just a few comments on what Jijuan was saying. While he was speaking, I was reminded of my boyhood in Dallas, Texas, when the people in charge, the Republicans, were convinced that the socialists were about to take over the country, that they were going to line up the true Americans against the wall and shoot them, like happened down in Cuba and so forth. So I've been hearing these forewarnings, civil war and slaughter and so forth between left and right in the United States for as long as I can remember. Unfortunately, things have been relatively peaceful. So I think, personally, I'm not too concerned. It's just a sort of familiar background noise, and it comes and goes depending upon who the candidates are and how worried they are about whether they're going to get reelected, and how much fear and anxiety they want to stir up in the population in an effort to get the law and order candidate elected. So in the other side is a progressive side that tries to make reasonable changes, like an income tax and Social Security and medical care and so forth, to make it possible for a wide range of people to survive in the country. And the thing that gets them upset is the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, which has been getting worse in recent years. And then there's the long-term racial disparities and racial repression in the country. So I'm getting some, I'll just disregard that. So those are the two positions that seem to reassert themselves from time to time. And so maybe my long history in the US makes me less concerned than Jijuan is. Now, obviously, he has a very unfortunate family history to point to in China. But I would hope that we'd focus a little bit more on science and philosophy and so forth, and kind of let the politicians fight it out amongst themselves.
Jamie, comments?
A very quick comment. My presentation is somehow picking up on some of Jason's ideas, as you will see. But what I hear in the conversation is like, okay, there's two parties, the left and the right, or whatever you want to call them, the ancient good and evil, and each party think they're the good ones and the other are the evil ones. But what is not being discussed a lot is that there's actually a third party involved, and you can see that very clearly in the literature, but also just hear it. And that is actually the old world order, I would say, or the holy alliance between the nobility and the Roman Catholic Church, who are just waiting for us to start our civil war, and then there will be a vacuum in power and they will take over, and then we have to deal with that item. So I'm like always stepping out of the discussions about whether there are communists in the school, because what I kind of see is we're being programmed to be afraid of the communists and we call everything communist for the purpose of making sure that those who are afraid of communism will not vote for Biden. And then at the other side, people are being programmed to think about capitalism as something horrible, and they're being programmed by all sorts of words and terminology to, I mean, racism, like that's the one. So everyone is a racist. So, and they're just being, buttons are being pushed. And so the two sides get totally worked up to attack one another. There's actually this third party that's doing it. And so I think what maybe Stuart is trying to say, we need to realize how much we can become puppets on a string. And that, I mean, I don't know whether you mean that, Stuart, but that people actually will wake up, and hopefully that enough people wake up to just not let themselves get manipulated that way. And so I kind of got to that sort of thinking just thanks to Karl Popper, and I will explain in my presentation a little more.
We're discussing social change and what cybernetics may contribute to it. And particularly in the context of practicality, you have Black Lives Matter, and the background tempo are the words, we need to change the system. And if anyone from our generation of the baby boomers, with all our pleas for change of systems, we failed. And so the question is, what are we able to do to understand how systems transform, change, and then put the judgmental skeleton upon it, the difference between vicious interactions and virtuous ones? It's a design question, but a design question has to have tools to understand what you're designing, what you're interacting with. If you're like Aristotle and talks about the potter and the clay, it's just imposition of your model on that clay vessel. And that's profound, and you have to interact with that clay a little bit too, and its properties, but it doesn't really speak back to you very much. The question here is, when you're dealing with living systems, how do you deal with when I squeeze Jamie's toe, she screams? You know, that's an interactive system. And how she will respond is not determined beforehand. So how we change systems in the context of Black Lives Matter and all our calls for systemic change is our topic today. Do people want to elaborate a little bit more upon what we want to accomplish today?
I think Jamie and I had a PPT prepared, and do you have one also?
I have one also, but okay. We want to get you know, the same format as we had before, which is a few slides and then discussion, and trying to come up at the end with a pot of observations, tools, directives, etc. So we need to be going towards a conclusion after each of our presentations.